friends and I ordered our food and were waiting for a few minutes. It took a little bit longer than usual, which isn't really an issue because we're not impatient or anything. But here was the weird part. They weren't busy. We were basically the only people in there waiting for food, and I think they had one other person who had already ordered who was sitting down and already eating.
You guys could hear.
I didn't see any cars in the drive-thru, and I just found the whole situation extremely bizarre. I'd noticed that the creepy guy was working, but I didn't see him for a very long time. He went behind a wall that I couldn't see him around, and I wasn't sure why he did this either. Life went on, and we got our food and sat down. I normally start by eating my fries and then have whatever my main meal is after that. Today it happens to be chicken nuggets. I got a 10-piece. As I was eating, I felt that creepy guy's watchful eyes looming over us. I felt really freaked out, and I convinced my friends to take our meal into the car to leave. As we left, I looked back to see him frowning at me. I didn't stop walking. Well, we got out there, and for a few minutes I felt like I was being paranoid and I overreacted. My friends thought so too, until I looked at my chicken nuggets. I looked inside of the box they were in, and they seemed to be covered in some kind of weird substance. I couldn't quite make it out, and I didn't know what to think. My immediate reaction was that they had put mayonnaise on it or something. Thankfully, I was smart enough to ask my friends before I took a bite. My one friend screamed, "That freak jizzed on your nuggets." The more I analyzed this strange substance on my chicken nuggets, the more convinced I became that it really was, in fact, that. That certainly explains why it had taken so long for us to get our food. I didn't quite understand how he was able to pull it off, though. He was one of at least 5 other workers there. It's not like they would have just allowed him to do this, right? Whatever the case may have been, I didn't feel comfortable eating those chicken nuggets, and I threw them out without hesitation. My friends and I were all really freaked out that this had happened to us. My friends threw out the rest of their food just to be on the safe side. We weren't really sure if we should have reported this incident to the police or something. We really didn't know what to do. We just kind of laughed it off as being one of those crazy life experiences, and that was it. I haven't gone back to McDonald's since this whole experience. But yeah, that's the story of how I ordered chicken nuggets one time, and the freaky guy working there put his secret sauce on them. Okay, I don't think you guys are even going to believe this story, but it's 100% true. It just happened last week. I don't know how else I could even preface this dumpster fire of a story, but here it goes. I'm a 22-year-old male, and I live with my fiancée. We had a nice apartment, but we were really looking to buy a house. I know, a little young for that, but we both landed really nice jobs after college and figured that it's better to get it out of the way now and start settling down. We're kind of old-fashioned like that. My fiancée's grandmother owns a home and no one lives in it. She had it for about a year since a family relative passed away. No one wanted anything to do with it since there was a lot of work that needed to be done, like painting the walls and redoing the floors and just various tasks like that. It wasn't completely horrible inside, but there was enough work that it literally sat there for a good little while. Well, my fiancé and I started talking to her grandmother after buying the place. She told us that she would sell it to us for a low enough price that we would be able to afford all of the renovations and whatnot. We were really excited about it. It was really exciting to think we were going to have purchased our first home together so shortly after graduating from college. But here was the problem. She had a lot of people in her family who started feeling left out. It was my fiancé's aunt and her 2 sons. Their father had died shortly after the second son was born, and the mother had a hard time coping with everything. She was a regular drinker and arguably an alcoholic. My fiancé told me that they were extremely negative people, and after meeting them a few times at family functions, I was surprised at how right she was. They lived in government housing. She collected disability fraudulently, and her 2 sons didn't work, despite one being 24 and the other being 19. There were whispers of drug abuse in there too. Suffice to know that these were not the kind of people you wanted to associate with. When word got out that we were buying the house from her grandma, they started feeling really left out. There were a few occasions where they'd try offering to watch the house, very obviously an attempt to get in there and do God only knows what. We politely declined and did everything we could to avoid them. I happened to be at the house one day. My fiancée was working and I work remotely online, so I was home alone. I had just walked down the street to buy a lemonade when I saw someone at her house. It was extremely unexpected. I got ready to confront a potential burglar when I noticed it was my fiancé's cousin trying to break in. He was startled when he saw me and froze for a minute. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me something about thinking he saw a car he didn't recognize in the driveway. I explained that it was my car, and he left without any big confrontation. As he walked away, though, I heard him start cursing under his breath. This was the point when I started feeling like we had something to worry about. Not feeling unsafe inside your own home is the worst feeling ever, especially being two young recent college graduates. We both worked really hard to make this happen, and the idea that it made us feel unsafe there really bothered us. I still didn't even understand what they wanted out of the whole ordeal. They didn't have enough money to afford the property tax alone. Forget about utilities and anything else. About 2 weeks went by without any kind of confrontation. I had falsely convinced myself that they'd finally leave us alone. I was dead wrong. We went to McDonald's one day, exactly 1 week ago today, the day I'm writing this. Me and my fiancé both just wanted to be out of the house for a little while. Considering we were in the process of buying a house, we didn't want to go eat anywhere expensive, so McDonald's just seemed like a logical decision. Now, before I continue, I feel the need to explain something about my fiancé and I. We are normally very serious people. We work very hard and we're both kind of workaholics, but when we get together to have some fun, we go hard. Work hard, play hard, right? Well, we got kind of silly when we played. Let me cut to the chase. We were both playing in the ball pit at our local McDonald's. We always enjoyed goofing off like that, and we weren't too concerned with what people would think of us. We'd only been messing around for 5 minutes when her cousin showed up at McDonald's too. It was creepy. He walked right in, looked at us the entire time. Before he even opened the front door, his eyes were stuck on us, and they felt heavy. My fiancée immediately knew something was wrong when my facial expression changed and she darted around to see what I was looking at. We both watched as her cousin made his way out to the ball pit. He stepped outside. As he walked, he moved his body to grab something out of his pocket. I couldn't see what it was, but my first thought was a gun or a knife. The look in his eyes told me he was out to do serious harm. He jumped into the ball pit in my direction. I luckily landed one solid punch in his face as he came down. It threw him off. I had an advantage. He kicked me in the stomach, but I landed a few more punches on his face. He started screaming for me to stop and that I was killing him. I would have kept going if my fiancée hadn't been watching. He started this, not me. We got out of the ball pit. He then began telling us that he was going to press charges on me for assaulting him. I wasn't even fazed by this. There were plenty of witnesses there that had seen the whole thing transpire. I started telling him that I was calling the cops and I was going to press charges on him. He got really panicked and ran back to his car and drove off. I'm not going to lie to you. This whole thing really shook me up. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. I looked around online and found an easy solution. A restraining order. My fiancée and I had both gotten restraining orders on her aunt and her 2 cousins. I didn't know why we didn't think of this sooner. It really solved the issue, and once they understood that we had a restraining order against them, they buggered right off. I haven't seen or heard from them since. And thankfully, and hopefully, that's the end of my story. My name's Gerald and I'm 22. For the past year, I've encountered a buttload of crazy people and have accumulated even more crazy stories. While most of them would make you laugh, the one I've chosen to share was terrifying while it was happening, and still gives me shivers when I remember it. A little more than a year ago, I applied for and got a job at my favorite convenience store across the street from my house. I'd moved there my sophomore year in college and decided to stay after I left school. This little store has served as a savior to me. Living as young men often do, I had very little money, but I was always confident I could find something to fill my belly regardless of how much was in my pocket at the time. So, when the time came, I was no longer able to rely on my parents for money. The corner store was the first place I went for a job. I was in luck. Only the day before, one of the employees was fired for stealing from the register. I took his place, and I've been here ever since. Like any other corner store, we sell alcohol. Beer, wine, liquor, the whole boat. Naturally, this makes us a beacon for the local drunks. These folks have served as countless hours of entertainment. While most are harmless people, on one specific occasion, a horribly violent outburst occurred. It was a quiet Saturday night, about an hour before close. Most of the regulars had made their appearances, a few more than once. The two involved in this incident had been in around 7 p.m. and had just returned. They were, or at least appeared to be, a couple. I'd seen them around the neighborhood since I moved in. The owner of the store said they'd been customers since he bought the store, and that was 13 years ago. Although they were not very talkative when they came in, I never had any reason to believe either could be violent. However, that night something had changed. Upon arriving the second time, they went straight to the cooler containing the quart and 40-ounce size beers. Nothing out of the ordinary, as I said, but tonight an argument between the two started soon after their arrival. Initially, I couldn't hear what it was about, but soon I could hear everything they said across the store. I minded my own business for a while, but once the female began screaming curse words at the man, I felt like I had to at least get them to take it outside. I wasn't sure what to say, but I began my walk to the opposite side of the small store. Before I was halfway there, the man started screaming back at the woman. I'm not sure exactly what she had said to him, but it had obviously infuriated him. Mere moments before, he had taken a quart bottle of Busch or some other cheap beer from the cooler. All of a sudden, he began striking down at the woman's head with it. I'm not sure if he thought it would break or if he intended on hurting her with the nearest thing, but strike after strike he continued. It was a horrifying thing to witness. I blame the entertainment industry for giving people the false impression of how easy it is to break a beer bottle over someone's head. I assure you, it's very hard. Following the fifth or sixth strike, the woman had dropped completely to the floor and stopped moving. The guy stood over her for a moment, but looked up when I assume he heard me running towards him. The second he saw me, he ran out the side door and disappeared into the darkness. The sight of her laying there made me sick to my stomach. The blood dripping from her ears was almost as shocking as the ever-growing pool around her head. It seemed like a bad idea to touch her, so I made the decision to let the paramedics check her for a pulse. When they arrived, she was still alive, but they didn't have much hope for her survival. The cops certainly weren't in any hurry to get there, but when they did finally arrive, 45 minutes later, I filled them in on all I had seen. From the way they reacted, I got a strong feeling that they were very familiar with the two. While on shift, a few days later, my boss called with some news. The female was brain dead, and her family had made the choice to let her pass. The cops had picked the guy up the following night. From the description my boss gave me, he didn't even seem to remember what had happened. The doctors that examined him said that it's likely he truly may not remember what he did, because of the many years of alcohol abuse had possibly destroyed his brain. Sounds like he might not get the full punishment due to him under the law. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. Sometimes, it seems like people really do get away with murder. During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time to mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and getting closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans included shooting guns, drinking beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us pretty busy cleaning the cabin and moving all our stuff inside. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I would do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make wise decisions. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that he had just bought. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what had happened, but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protestations, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger, in other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity.
Well, I keep forgetting
I'd
that
seen
on
this
my phone.
mysterious being stalking around us twice, and now it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned him, an owner of one of the surrounding properties, had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land, so we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for them. A mile or so down one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. tracking them. Another mile on, we stumble upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third.
Go, guys.
The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin.
Yeah, I think we're doing pretty good.
No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled it out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked everything the night before, so the police were none the wiser. Nothing was missing but a box of .30-30 ammo and, strangely, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputy's mind that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger, like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year, we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same, and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease were renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do, once or twice a year, talk to my old college friends on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still hasn't been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called strangers seem to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago? I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open and anyone could piggyback off of someone else entering the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins and other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I got to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually start to doze off. I've become aware of a noise that sounds like a clicking sound, but it sounds like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kind of zoned this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realized the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then start focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from.
I'll hold that
Suddenly
wheat
it
so
hits
that they'll
me.
follow me.
It's coming
better.
from the entrance to my apartment. I leap out of bed and head to the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, like someone is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is inserted into the lock and the person is jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turn around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with the combination, and pull out my .357 SIG pistol, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber a hollow point round. I head back to the door, and as I exit the bedroom, I see the lock twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone comes through, I will have to make a split-second reaction. I decide that if someone comes through my door, I will give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they do anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. They don't enter. However, because I had also locked the deadbolt inside only, when I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side are 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 are wearing hoodies, so it's difficult to make out their faces. The men have objects in their hands, but I can't make out exactly what. The 2 men are talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they have successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman is also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She's talking in another language. The only words I can make out are blah blah blah, apartment 250, blah blah blah, and she keeps repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or even given it to anyone. And here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but, as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from the door, I take a long broom handle and jab it hard in the face of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stop fiddling with the lock and take off running. I debate whether to call 911 and decide against it until they return. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there. It would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as it is to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for a police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but it's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I am proud of how I stayed calm and was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. I've had a few delivery jobs that have given me the creeps. 1 or 2 that I was pretty sure I was about to be robbed. Another was a gunfight between gang members unfolding in the street I was delivering to, right as I was turning onto it. But these are just occupational hazards. Yeah, it sucks, but I guess you do get over them. Only one delivery job really, truly terrified me. The only one that scares me to think about even today. So we get an order from an address that none of us drivers had ever delivered to before. This normally causes some suspicion among us since we're always pretty wary whenever delivering to a new address. A fair few first-time deliveries have resulted in an address getting blacklisted, Sometimes they try to stiff you for money or some other scam to get free pizza. Generally speaking, the drivers take turns delivering to a new address, and this time, it just so happened to be my turn. So once the order is completed and the pizzas are boxed up, I take them out to my car and punch the address into my sat-nav. It turns out the address is right on the edge of our delivery area, pretty much in the middle of absolute nowhere. It dawns on me that this could be the oldest trick in the book. Call the pizza into some hard-to-reach location, then demand it to be free once it takes more than 45 minutes to deliver. But, to my relief, I make it out onto this old dirt road with time to spare. Yet my relief doesn't last long, not when I see the state of the address I'm delivering to. The house is so run down it looks like a squat, like it's been commandeered by the homeless as a place to avoid sleeping rough. There's a musty old pickup in the driveway, its wheels all askew from years of misuse. I mean, the place was just the very definition of haunted house. Needless to say, I wasn't expecting a particularly generous tip. As I take the pizzas out from the passenger seat of my car, I start hearing this faint, whining noise. My ears prick up immediately and I freeze, trying to work out just what the sound is and where it's coming from. I come to realize it's the sound of a violin being played, but more accurately, it was the sound of a violin being played very badly. These discording noises carried on as I walked up the dirt pathway toward the porch and the front door. The sound of some old violin bow being dragged across dry old strings that were way out of tune. Creepy, sure, but that's not what terrified me. When I knocked on the front door, the screaming cat violin sounds ceased instantly. A few moments of silence went by before I began to hear slow, heavy footsteps growing steadily closer. I can't be certain, but I'm almost sure I heard someone breathing on the other side. These heavy, labored breaths as I waited for the door to open. The silence was broken by a metallic snap of the door unlocking, before hurried footfalls sounded on the other side. Someone had unlocked the door, then scampered away from it as if they were overtly skittish about visitors. Hello? I got your pizza order here. I remember asking, feeling the tension rise as silence once again engulfed the scene. Come inside, mister. A childish voice came from the other side. I wanted to just turn tail and run at this point, but returning to the pizza place without the money for the pizzas would definitely mean a verbal or written warning from my manager. I already had one for turning up late. I couldn't afford another. So reluctantly, I took hold of the door handle, turned it, and walked inside. The interior of the house was bathed in darkness, only a handful of weak oil lamps to give me any sense of the layout. A figure was crouched on a nearby sofa, the old violin laying next to it. There's 15 on the table there, mister. The person sounded like a child, but they looked bigger than they should have. On the small, dusty coffee table in front of the couch, there's a pile of change in little piles. Normally, I'd have taken issue with this, but to be honest, I was desperate to get out of there at that point. I'd have taken any form of currency. As I stooped down to start sliding the little piles of coins into my cupped palm, I started to hear the kid's labored breathing again, but I dared not look towards him. I could see its legs in my peripheral vision, and even then, I could see how unnaturally long they were. This person was not a child. Sorry about the coins, mister. I saved them up. I saved them all up to afford this treat for myself. It's all I have. I told the person not to worry in the sunniest disposition I could muster. The last thing I wanted to do at this point was upset them. I pocketed the coins, barely having counted them. I'd come up with a difference myself if I needed to. Like I said, I just wanted to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, hastily thanking the person, I caught a glimpse of the person's face in the low light of the oil lamps. They were burned, horribly burned up and down their arms and chest. The scarred flesh extended all the way up their face and head. Only the person's features were obscured by a small rubber mask. The mask didn't even cover up their entire face, only a small central portion that concealed their eyes, nose, and mouth. The only thing I could really make out was that the mask had a long wooden nose, kind of like the puppet Pinocchio, whose nose would grow whenever he told lies. The small carved eyes were blank. I averted my gaze from the mask and was unable to return it. It was one of the most hideously sad and scary things I'd ever laid eyes on. Just as I had reached the front door, I heard that same childlike voice emanating behind me. "Want to hear me play a song, mister?" Before I even had the chance to answer, to tell them I was too busy with deliveries to hang out, they had grabbed the old violin next to them and began to whine out of tune. Although the strings were almost totally out of tune, I started to make out the tune they were trying for. You know the one. If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down in the woods today, you better go in disguise. For every bear that ever there was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic. I was in the back of the driver's seat of my car before you could say, "Nope, I'm out," scrambling to start the engine so I could make a quick getaway. I don't think they had any intention of hurting me. I certainly wasn't as in much danger as when those idiot Crip and Blood wannabes decided to shoot it out like right in front of my car. But something about that mind while I lay there in darkness trying to sleep. Something that means I'll never, ever make another delivery there. I'll quit before I go back. I'm ashamed to say it, but it needs to be said. I screwed up on my job and a man died because of it. Not just a man I was being paid to protect. Usually it can be forgiven for making a mistake on my first job. However, when it's your first job protecting another man from outside dangers, one mistake can be the last. In retrospect, hindsight, whatever word you use, I wish I'd never agreed to taking the job. Just being a large-built man with a license to carry doesn't make you qualified to be a private security. This all being said, I took the job. The client losing his life is a direct result of my negligence. Maybe if I discuss what happened, I can relieve myself of a small amount of this burden. However, I can assure you I know the guilt will never truly fade away. The job came out of nowhere. Mike, a close friend of mine, had been a bodyguard on and off for years. He made it clear the job was a one-time only deal. No other guys he knew were available on such short notice. His next client was coming into town in the morning. Mike needed someone with a carry permit to back him up. He knew I had one, so I got the call. He assured me it wasn't a dangerous situation, but he'd like to have another guy to watch his and the client's back. I was somewhat nervous initially, but the money I was offered was too good to pass up. We met up at his place later that night. He gave me a rough outline of what I was expected to do. Once it had been all laid out before me, it seemed simple enough. Although this would be his first time with this particular client, he assured me once more it would be simple. After all, the guys with the real problems always had their own staff. Our client was a regular suit and tie in town for some business. 4 hours of work and he'd be back on a plane home. The morning of the job, we met with the client at the airport. A third guy, Roger, was doing the driving for us that day. He's a retired SWAT officer who picked up the occasional driving job for Mike. He'd had a boatload of training in evasive maneuvers while he was in the Army. Plus, he could be a third gun in an emergency. He drove us to the client's first appointment, and everything was going well. From what I could make out, the dude was a wholesale jeweler out of London. Stuff didn't really start falling apart until we were leaving the second place. As we exited the jeweler's store, I noticed a sketchy-looking, possibly Middle Eastern guy. He was standing in front of the place next door. When he noticed us leaving, he pulled a knife from his pocket and ran towards us. Before he could get anywhere near us, I instinctively moved toward him. He turned and ran, and I foolishly gave chase. I had gotten somewhere around 30 yards and heard a barrage of gunshots behind me. I turned around just in time to see Mike go down. The client was already on the ground and wasn't moving. Roger was standing next to the car, shooting at 2 men running from the scene. By the time I'd drawn my pistol, the firefight had ended. It was clear to me I'd messed up. As Roger and I checked Mike and the client for signs of life, a weak few words came from Mike. "I hope you won't be offended if I don't ask for your help again." We had a brief chuckle, but we both knew this wasn't a laughing matter. Roger confirmed that the client was in fact dead. I rode to the hospital with Mike, and Roger stayed behind with the cops. This big mess made no sense. I knew I could trust Mike. He said the client indicated no current danger to his life. We were supposed to be only there to prevent robberies. We'd both seen the guy with a load of stones on him, so no flags went up. Regardless, considering the number of guys in on the hit, I had a strong feeling we didn't get the whole story. I'd been waiting for news on Mike for about half an hour when Roger finally showed. The cops were right behind him. Now it was my turn. When they were done with me, they wanted to talk to Mike, but he was still in surgery. 2 hours later, we got the good news. He was going to make it. But he'd be in the hospital for the next week at the least. For the next 9 days, I stayed at his side. It was the least I could do. The following morning, we had our first discussion since the shooting. "You do realize the guy with the blade was a decoy, right?" "It became pretty obvious once I heard you all yell at me to come back." "Listen, don't feel guilty. It's not your fault. I've fallen for dumber things than that." We continued our talk for a while until Mike fell asleep. No matter what he said, though, I'd always feel bad. A man lost his life, after all. The detectives showed up later that day and pumped him for any new info, but Mike had none. Mike was released 8 days later. Neither of us heard anything new until Roger called Mike 5 days later with some inside information he'd gotten from one of his pals. The client had been far from honest with us. He had hired us because he was involved in a deal with some men in which he screwed them out of $100,000. They had made it known if he was to return to the States, he'd be whacked. If Mike would have known this beforehand, he wouldn't have taken the job. That's likely why the dirtbag kept it quiet. Somehow this bit of info had made it past the background check. Nonetheless, even a crook doesn't deserve to be sprayed with bullets on a public street. We were only hearing it from their side. It could have all been a huge misunderstanding. After my anger cooled, it became obvious to me that I was just deflecting my feelings onto the client. Thief or not, I was responsible for the safety of the man. Not only had my mistake gotten him killed, a very good friend of mine almost did too. When Mike's back in fighting shape, I'm sure he'll return to security work, albeit in a slightly more careful manner. I'm just glad he's still kicking. I hope he gets someone in the future far more competent than myself. When it comes to me, I think I'll stick to construction. It appears to be a whole lot safer. For a little context, I am currently a senior in college and live off campus with my 2 best friends. This time of year, particularly around Thanksgiving, my friends try to help me stay busy as it is typically a difficult time for me. My mother left our family the week of Thanksgiving when I was 8 years old, and my dad passed away 5 years ago on November 22nd. So as I said, it's a pretty easy time of year to get myself down in the dumps if I don't stay active. Every year for the last 3 or 4 years, I have gone to one of my friends' houses to celebrate Thanksgiving with their families. But this past year, I decided I wanted to just stay home and have a mellow long weekend. I figured I could catch up on work as well as my schoolwork, which was pretty far behind. My roommates and I didn't live particularly close to the university. We lived in a suburb about 15 to 20 minutes outside of the school. This was nice because we didn't ever have to host any parties. We could just attend them near campus and head back home afterwards. Anyways, there was one house on our street that didn't quite match the others. It wasn't that the house was worse than the others, but it had no landscaping and desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. My roommates and I knew the owner as he introduced himself when we moved in a few years back. His name is Jacob. He's about 5'6" and probably weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. Every time we've had an interaction with him, he was always very nice and polite. He even helped us fix our porch light when it broke last summer. He seems to be very cordial with everyone in the neighborhood and has helped numerous people with small handy jobs similar to the one I just mentioned. On the Wednesday night leading up to Thanksgiving, my two roommates went back to their families' houses in their hometowns. They both asked several times if I was 100% sure I wanted to spend Thanksgiving alone and that I'd be fine by myself. I honestly thought I would be, and thought perhaps enough time had passed that I could just focus on other things and not dwell on the past. I stocked up on Mountain Dew so I could stay awake after my assignments to play some PlayStation. At about 9 or 10 p.m., I went up to my room to throw on some sweatpants and grab the blanket for my bed. I glanced out my window and saw Jacob sitting on his front porch with the two porch lights on. I didn't think anything of it and went downstairs into the kitchen and made a peanut butter and fluff sandwich. I would say I was in the kitchen for probably about 5 minutes or so, finishing eating and doing a few dishes. When I finally sat down to play some games, I thought I heard something hit the front bay window, so I went to take a look. At first, I didn't see anything, but then noticed that Jacob had now turned the porch lights off and was standing on his front lawn, staring at the house with his head tilted like he was looking towards the windows upstairs. A little creeped out, I tried calling one of my friends who knew I was still in town to see if she wanted to meet up or stop over to hang out for a little bit. She didn't answer, so I sat on the couch for a couple of moments trying to figure out what to do. He was still standing there staring and seemingly moving a few feet closer to our property each time I looked. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't call the cops. He hadn't done anything except freak me out a little, and to this point, he hadn't even stepped on my property. After another few minutes, I looked out the window again and saw Jacob now on our lawn looking at the corner of the house. At least that's what it looked like he was staring at. At this point, I wasn't sure what his intentions were, and I didn't want to find out. Perhaps I was blowing this out of proportion, but I was legitimately scared. I grabbed my keys and phone and a few other items, thinking I would just drive to campus. Maybe the library was still open, even though we were off for the holiday. I kept all the lights on so I didn't seem like I was leaving and decided I was going to sneak out the back door. As I quietly sneaked through the yard, I turned the corner to quickly get to my car, and there was Jacob, standing in our driveway. I asked him what he was doing in the driveway, and he put his finger over his mouth to make a shh noise. I slapped him as hard as I could and made a run for it past my car. My instincts and adrenaline told me to just run until I found someone or someplace else. As I got about a block or two down the road, I saw a bunch of cop cars pull up towards the area of my house. Confused, I began to go back towards my house, thinking perhaps another neighbor saw Jacob stalking outside of my house and called the police. As I approached the house, one of the officers asked my name and if this was my residence. I confirmed the information, and what I heard next is still the most horrifying and disturbing information I had ever received. The officer stated that Jacob reported that he was on his porch when he saw me from across the street. He saw me walk out of my upstairs bedroom, and as I walked away out of the room, he saw a man come out of my closet. Apparently that was why Jacob was looking into my room when I saw him the first time, and also why he was looking at the corner of the house. He was following the intruder who was now walking into my roommate's room. When I last saw him outside my house before I slapped him and ran in terror, Jacob stated that the random guy in my house had made it to the downstairs. Jacob was trying not to make any noise as not to alert the person inside, fearful he could be violent or dangerous. As soon as he saw the man in the house, Jacob called the authorities and did his best to try and defuse the situation and not bring any alarm to myself or the intruder. The person inside the house was arrested and taken away. He didn't have anything on him other than a knife, so it is unclear if he was attempting to rob the home or was planning something more sinister. Either way, I couldn't express to Jacob how much gratitude I had for what he did. He even tried apologizing for how he handled the situation, stating that There were probably things he could have done differently to make sure I was safe and aware of the situation. Unfortunately, this experience adds another mental scar to this time of year that will take a long time to get over. But one thing I can be sure of is that I will never spend a Thanksgiving holiday alone again. This incident occurred during my second year of college, sometime in the fall of 2002. All 4 years there, I worked as a waitress in a small family restaurant next to campus. The pay was far from adequate, but the owners treated me like one of them. Growing up without parents made this connection very important to me, so much so they remain an important part of my life to this day. I was one of 4 girls working nights, and 3 of us were students currently attending the university. The surrounding neighborhood had been on a downward slide for the past 20 years. Even with a large number of students inhabiting the area, crime was still steadily on the rise. In order to at least try to prevent ourselves from becoming victims of said crime, several safety measures were implemented. All the usual things. Escorting each other to our cars, not leaving the back door open, things like that. However, no matter how hard you try to be safe, some a-hole will find a way to violate you anyway. One late night, just as we were wrapping up the dinner shift, a giant idiot would do just this, and in the process, almost cause a beautiful family to collapse. That night, we were quickly coming on the end of another regular dinner shift when a man came in and said he wanted to get something to go. No problem. I took his order and gave it to the kitchen. Working the kitchen that night was Matt, the owner's only son, and he wasn't happy when he saw it. He tried to throw it together as fast as possible so he could finish cleaning and head home. While he waited, the man paced nervously, looking outside repeatedly. This behavior seemed kind of shady. So I stopped my closing duties and began looking outside to see if I could see what he was looking at. It took a minute, but I caught sight of another man standing just out of view of the bay windows. This guy was dirty looking. His hair looked like it hadn't been washed or combed in years. The second man's actions were very similar to the others, almost as if though they were about to rob us. I foolishly pushed my instincts aside and began ringing up the man's orders. When I gave him the total, he quickly handed me a $20 bill and looked behind him. I continued to ignore his behavior, and when I opened the drawer, I heard a man's voice quietly tell me to give him all the money in the register. Maybe from instinct, I looked up to see who it was. It was all coming from the customer, and he was holding a handgun at my face. Keep your voice down, don't panic.
How to get a honeycomb in Minecraft.
According to what do you do with honeycomb in Minecraft? Honeycomb can be harvested from bee nests and hives with shears. You'll get between 1 and 3 bits of honeycomb that way.
Just give me the money and I'll leave. This entire time I had been the only employee in the front of the house, so he had me at his mercy. Every word he said quivered as it came from his mouth. His fear made mine even worse. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed every cent out of the drawer and was about to hand it to him when I heard Matt's voice coming from behind me.
How do you make a artificial nest for bees?
Did you forget something?
How to make a nest for Minecraft bees?
According to PC Games N, how to make beehives in Minecraft. You can craft your own Minecraft beehive using wood planks and honeycomb. In the crafting grid, place 3 wood planks.
God damn it, I don't have honeycomb.
I
We're
still question
frick.
my recollection of events to this day. I know for sure that Matt's arrival surprised us both, but the look on the customer,
Where do I get honeycomb, bro?
The second I noticed
I
him
could just
moving
kill
away
the
from
bees,
my
but
face, I crouched behind the
I
podium
don't know what to
hide.
do. They'll
The
despawn, I
gunfire
think,
followed
but
soon after.
why does it have to be so difficult? Why can't you guys just make a new nest?
Very similar to a child hiding under the covers in hopes the boogeyman will go away.
Well, I should just release them into the
I
wild.
stayed like that.
I'll put a couple, there's a couple flowers out here.
From my arms, all I saw was Matt's body laying motionless on the floor. Even then, I stayed
Sorry,
where I was
I don't have
until
any
I heard
more.
the voice of his mom yelling out to us.
God damn it, man.
That's when I finally stood up to see the results. The shooter was gone, and money was scattered all over the floor from where I dropped it. Matt more than likely died immediately. At his feet, grilled chicken salad was scattered everywhere like the money. Matt's mom stormed out of the back. When she saw her only son lying on the floor, she collapsed in grief next to him, and this is where she stayed until the police arrived. Just to avoid making an already long story longer, I'll leave you with the facts. Even after telling the cops everything I saw and giving a detailed description of both men, neither man was caught. The family closed the restaurant for several days after the shooting and stayed that way until a few days after the funeral. From the day of the reopening, a cop in plain clothes has protected the place, and there hasn't ever been another holdup since. My work at the restaurant would continue for the remainder of my time at the university.
Should've just left the
I was shaken up
bees.
for quite a while, and
Should've just left the bees so I can know what to do. But no, I was selfish and I had to take the bees home. And now I don't have another home for them.
Brought closer together.
No,
After I
at
graduated,
least
I moved
we
on.
have
I'm currently
pumpkins
living in
now.
Atlanta with my partner.
Should I get
The
chickens? I
restaurant
don't need
continues
them for
running 5 days a
anything.
week
Like, I could
very
use them
well.
for food, but I already have
Seems the
enough of that.
neighborhood may be on its
Like,
way up.
arrows I already have like
In the last year,
trillions.
several large companies have opened branches.
Now that I
and
have the
growth has
seed,
proved
let's
to be a
just
positive thing for all concerned.
take a couple
Allison,
of them
the
home.
matriarch of the family, recently told me on a phone call that she was willing to put up with the hipsters that were slowly invading the area. After all, they were a big step up from the murdering crackheads that had been seen there before.
See.
Do you remember as a kid, where you imagined dentists as some kind of crazy psychos who enjoy hurting people? And how they wanted to rip out all of your teeth against your will? Well, we all know now that we were just overreacting kids back then. But it wasn't exactly false for me. When one day, my childhood nightmare became a reality. And this experience is something that has forever left a mark and a trauma on me. Me and my boyfriend back then moved in together and wanted to start a new life in a new town.
Home and everything.
We both came from poor families with experiences of alcohol abuses.
I should just finish them
So,
off. They
we
have
couldn't
nowhere to
afford much,
go.
and we had to work really hard to sustain our needs. One evening,
I believe
when
in
I
you,
came back
buddy.
from work, my tooth
Not you.
started to
You get to
hurt a
die.
lot. I
Oh,
tried to ignore
dog!
it because I thought it
No,
was just
puppy!
tired and it would eventually go away after some time. So I went to bed and fell asleep. But in the morning, the pain got worse.
You're never gonna
I
breathe
told that to
there.
my boyfriend,
I'm
and
sorry,
he
you're
started
just
to worry.
too perfect,
We didn't
and
have
I don't
any
have any more
insurance
colors.
because we hardly even
Any more
have
natural
money for
colors I
basic
could give
needs.
anyone else
So
for your
for
family.
us, this was a big problem. We
You're
started to
going to
search
be
through
great,
the
I
internet
know.
and local magazines for dental clinics, but most of them were very expensive and clearly we couldn't afford them. My condition was getting worse to the point that I couldn't even focus on my work most of the time. Desperately, I called to my parents. I begged them for help and asked to send us some money, but they refused. By now, you guys probably know what they were like, and that's the exact reason why I moved out from there. At the end of my shift, my boyfriend called me with some good news. He found a really cheap dentist in town, and he immediately made an appointment for me. He texted me the address and told me to be there at exactly 7 p.m. tonight. I packed my things from work and went to the bus stop. When I arrived there, I went into the building and sat down on a chair next to the clinic room. I could hear two people talking inside the room, so I decided not to interrupt and wait for my turn. After 10 minutes, some lady just ran out of the room like she was in a hurry or something. She dropped her wallet on the floor, but before I noticed it, she was already gone. Meanwhile, the door opened again,
and a pleasant man's voice invited me in. I turned around and I could see a short, middle-aged man with a big smile. I greeted him and told him about the lady and the wallet she dropped. He said, "Oh, don't worry. She was in a hurry for a bus. You can give me her wallet. She's a close friend of mine and I'll give it back to her." I gave him the wallet and brushed off the situation. For the next few minutes, we talked and filed all the necessary papers. I told him about my toothache. He seemed so nice and funny. Then he prepared his dental equipment and I sat down on the chair. And after that, things started to get weird. He told me to open my mouth wide so that he could start the examination. I don't know why, but it felt like he was standing too close to me. Besides, shouldn't dentists sit down on their chair while working too? Then I felt a rubbing sensation on my arm. It was so weird. I thought it was his leg, but later I realized it wasn't. I thought he wasn't doing it on purpose, so I tried to move my arm a bit, but his body followed my arm. He tried to chat me up to distract me from whatever he was doing, but I could feel everything. Then he stopped for some time, but a few seconds later, he just grabbed my arm and told me not to move that much. He was holding me really tight. I had enough, so I gathered my courage to tell him to stop. But he just sighed. Fortunately, a few seconds later, he released my arm. After this confrontation, he started to act harsh and rude. He seemed like he was offended and didn't want to smile anymore. Nothing really happened after that, until I finished my dental appointment where he told me to come back again for a follow-up treatment next week. After leaving, I felt so scared of him and didn't want to go back. I could see him looking through the window of his clinic with a really angry or disappointed face, like he was expecting something from me. I told what just happened to my boyfriend, but he told me I was just overreacting and we couldn't afford any other dentist. So I should be grateful that he found me a clinic that fits our budget. I knew that he wanted what's best for me, but as I said, we were in a bad financial situation, so I couldn't complain and be picky in this time. I knew I had to go back there again, but at least he did his job and my tooth didn't hurt anymore. Fast forward to my second dental appointment. I was feeling so anxious right before the meeting, but unexpectedly, he greeted me with the same big smile as before. We chatted like nothing happened and he proceeded to the treatment very professionally. Everything seemed to be okay while he was treating me. This time, he sat on a chair and didn't do anything weird. In the middle of the operation, I was looking at him and he seemed nervous. We were sitting in silence for some time when, out of nowhere, he told me, "Hey, I really like your body. You were just my type." It was so confusing and it felt so awkward. I couldn't even answer him with a fully open mouth, but I started to move my lips and replied, "I appreciate your compliment." Then there was just dead silence.
You sit here. I don't want to worry about you.
I started to look around the room and I noticed the wallet. I realized it was the same wallet that I gave him a week ago after some lady dropped it on her way out. Something was wrong with this guy. My heartbeat was pounding and I started to sweat. Then he said, "Come to my apartment after the treatment, just for a tea." I immediately knew what was going on, and I replied to him, Thanks for the invite, but I have a boyfriend and I respect him, so I don't want to hang out with some other men." "Come on, I don't ask you to go to bed with me. Just for a tea. He won't find out," he replied. I refused again, but he insisted. He was trying so hard to convince me that he was literally forcing me to agree. The worst thing was he was holding his dental drill and started to become violent with it. He started to push it harder and harder into my teeth. I couldn't see, but I knew something bad was going on and he was intentionally doing it to me. I could feel more and more pain while he was doing this. "You will go with me, right? Just for a tea. Just for a tea, okay?" He was repeating it over and over again. I stopped replying to him, and now I was just looking for a way to escape. But I didn't want to hurt myself with all those dental equipment, so I just didn't move. I could feel he was drilling in my tooth harder and harder. I felt like crying from the pain, but I didn't want to show him that I am an easy target. Finally, I said to him, "Okay, I will go with you." His face instantly turned from angry to cheerful, and he said, "Sweet," with a big smile like nothing had happened. Then he stepped away from me to grab something from the table, and I took my chance to hit him on the head with any item next to my chair, and I ran away from the clinic as fast as I can. I wasn't even trying to look behind me if he was chasing me or if he was still inside. I just wanted to escape from this crazy maniac. When I ran out of breath after a few blocks, I stopped to take some air. Fortunately, I couldn't spot him anywhere. Then I realized something was pouring out of my mouth. It was blood. He did something to me, and I couldn't see how bad it was. I slowly placed my finger into my mouth and checked every tooth. I came across something that felt really weird. I counted all of them and realized that there was something quite missing. But then I realized he just drilled my tooth deeper into my gums. I came back to my house and told everything in tears to my boyfriend. He drove me to the police station and I gave a statement. They directed us to the state dental clinic to check for damages. The damages were so bad that they had to remove my tooth. I couldn't take it anymore and bursted out into tears. It was so hard for me because we couldn't even afford an implant back then. Meanwhile, the police drove to that guy's clinic to take him to custody. He insisted that he was innocent. It was just a medical mistake and that I was crazy. He testified that I made it all up. If you want to know how it all ended, then here is the harsh reality. Unfortunately, the law system favors the rich people, and he was only fined a few thousands as a punishment. I bet he had deals with the police too. He didn't go to jail nor was forced to close his dental clinic. I couldn't afford a good lawyer, so I couldn't do much back then. And this crazy maniac is still seeing patients. I remembered the name of the lady drew an ID from her wallet and asked the police about her. They told me that the lady was reported missing about a week ago, and nothing more. Up to this day, all I'm wondering is that what he did to that lady and how many more women did that maniac sexually harass and have physically hurted over the course of his time operating the clinic.
Back when I was 17, I used to babysit for our neighbor, who at the time was a single mother who happened to be going through a particularly nasty divorce. She had 2 young sons, one of which was 8 years old, while the other was only around 18 months. They were absolutely adorable and very well-behaved kids, but you could tell that they were going through a lot. And the older one definitely showed signs of stress over the whole thing. And I'll never forget the time he asked me why his daddy couldn't live with them anymore, and it honestly broke my heart. Not because I didn't have an answer for him, but because to hear it would have just been too much to bear. Too much for anyone to bear. Anyway, after a few months of being alone, she finally decided to get back on the old dating horse. I was so happy for her. After such a rough time, she deserved to find happiness again. To find someone who had the wherewithal to be a real father to these 2 adorable little boys. So one night she leaves on her date and says she'll be back around midnight and not a moment later. Only she doesn't tell me exactly where she's going, and I have no way to contact her because this was back in the 80s and no one had a cell phone. Well, they did exist, but not in the available commercial sense. It was all landlines back then. Otherwise, this might not have gone the way it did. So on the night in question, I'm chilling on the couch, absent-mindedly flicking through the TV channels. I put the kids to bed an hour previous. They're sleeping like rocks, and everything seems fine and dandy. When suddenly there's a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but then again, it wasn't my house, so I felt kind of obligated to answer and take a message or whatever. Only as I started walking down the hallway towards the front door, whoever is on the other side starts banging against it and cursing up a storm. "Cheryl, I know you're in there. Open the door." Now, what was exactly said, I don't remember, but I'm not keen on repeating some of the words they used. It was really, really harsh. So I'm just frozen, looking at the door in total fright when the oldest boy came flying out of his room and down the stairs, running to the door and yelling, "Daddy's home." I grab him, pull him away from the door. I had no idea what this guy's intentions were, and after all, they were probably divorced for a freaking reason. But I almost fainted with fear when I hear the words, "I got my shotgun in my truck, and tonight, I'm gonna teach you a lesson you'll never forget." He screams this, but then I hear his footsteps move up the gravel path. It appeared he wasn't bluffing at all. And if that was the case, then our lives were clearly in danger. When he gets back, he's banging on the door and threatening to start shooting through it if no one opens. I grab both kids and run out the back door and across the street to my house where my mom calls the police. When the police arrive a few minutes later, they actually find the ex-husband taking a massive dump on Cheryl's porch. He was arrested, and I wait with the kids at my house for their mom to show up. Everyone was in tears by that point, even my mom, who was normally a pretty reserved woman. I mean, maybe he was just having a manic episode and no one was in real danger, but honestly, it was one of the most terrifying nights of my entire life. When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal, and everyone loved him. I can attest to that as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called his father and had talked with him about spending more time with his son and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad was playing basketball with his son after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know he was going to be firing him the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person. As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him despite my grandfather's warning. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he could deal with it in the morning. Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset was hysterically crying but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shoot him. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead. What was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he could never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a hit list of people that he was going to kill, and all the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission.
In an ever-changing world, Vistaprint is here to help. Tucked nicely.
I stared at my bright computer screen. My eyes felt heavy, and my fingers trembled nervously with each key press. We'd already been away
Where's my dog?
more than 5 days, during which time 28 players had died. I don't want to die, Lewis typed into the chat. I'm not so sure you will. There's only the 2 of us left. I can't keep this up much longer. The game had seemed so simple. A competition to see who could stay awake the longest, and the winner would receive enough money to last a lifetime. For someone like myself, without a social life nor a job to attend, it was the perfect opportunity. 30 players had received an invitation, all active participants of an international dark web forum. We were just required to fill in some necessary information, including a Bitcoin wallet to where the money would be sent. After clicking submit, I was given a time and a list of simple rules to follow.
Yeah, and this is the last
Both your web camera and
breeding
microphone must
for
be
a
activated
very
for the
long
entire
time
duration
until I
of the
get to
competition.
expand their cage,
Number 2,
because
there
now we
won't
barely
be
have
bathroom
enough
breaks. Flash warning.
grass for all of them to get
Number
their
3,
wool back,
you're not
so
allowed
we
to seek
gotta
out the physical location
start
of the other contestants.
reducing this.
Number 4, there can only be 1 winner. As I eagerly awaited for the first bit of excitement I had seen in months, I stocked up on the necessary supplies, mostly energy drinks, snacks, and a bucket. Once the time of the competition started, I clicked the provided link. I was faced with a blank screen consisting of 30 names and a chat box. I could gain access to each of the competitors' camera feeds by clicking on their username, but the chat itself was global. I guess no one here speaks English, Insomnia 90 said. A few of the participants responded with broken sentences. It seemed that out of the 30 members of the chat, only myself and Insomnia 9 were native speakers. 2 days went by in the blink of an eye, and 7 players had already left the game in silence. I spent most of my time watching movies and chatting to Insomnia 90, who I'd come to know as Lewis. He was a Canadian university student on break, bored out of his mind. Hey, check out the German guy. He's about to pass out, Lewis said. I clicked on his username. It would be the first participant we'd actually see falling asleep. His eyes were already half closed, and his body shifted towards the edge of his chair. We chuckled at the guy as we got one step closer to victory. Not long after, his consciousness wandered off the edge, and he fell into a deep pit of sleep. Only a second passed before his eyes shot back open in a horrified panic. As he clutched his ears and screamed in agony, his body started twitching uncontrollably in all the wrong directions, and blood poured from his nose and ears. It looked as if his brain had been scrambled to pieces inside his own head. Within a minute, he fell over, dead, his face softly resting on the keyboard. What the f*** was that? I asked. Is he dead? Lewis replied. I frantically started clicking on every other username, checking if anyone else was about to fall asleep. Check the Swedish one, I said. Sure enough, he drifted off no more than a minute earlier. Suddenly, his eyes shot open, and he sees just like the German had before him. Another minute, and he just added to the rapidly growing pile of corpses. We warned the others as best we could. Only a few of them seemed to get the message, each getting out from their chairs in an attempt to flee. Alas, no sooner had they decided to run, before they dropped dead on the floor. Oh God, we're gonna die, aren't we? Lewis said. I guess only the winner survives, I had taken back. 3 days passed. During that time, we made numerous attempts at contacting the outside world. Phone calls, emails, messages. They were all blocked. Lewis and I were the only players left, keeping each other awake as we searched in despair for a way out. I already ran out of supplies, so if sleep deprivation didn't get me, dehydration would. Then I noticed that Lewis hadn't spoken in a few minutes. Lewis, no, wait, God. I called out to no avail. He had already died. As he left the game, I was declared the winner. 29 people had died, and I was gifted an unfathomable amount of cash. Since then, I've been searching for Lewis's family. Even if they weren't close, I want them to know that he was a good person up until the end. I am so sorry. I wish it had been. Vital Farms butter comes from cows with outdoor access all year round.
American Family Farm.
And me. I've always had a morbid sense of curiosity. And while that's not a fact I'm particularly proud of, I've always just jotted it down to teenage curiosity. To be honest, it probably started back in middle school when people thought it was fun to send around horrible videos of executions and bizarre porn fetishes to each other on the MSN messaging site. Just mentioning it makes me feel old. These days, there's an overabundance of these sites. Places to watch people die, blurry videos of car crashes, beheadings, and animal abuse. Of course, it's not something I actively seek out, but when I stumble across it, I feel compelled to just watch, to prove to myself that nothing can affect me. Though, for the truly gruesome stuff, one needs to visit the so-called dark web. As a guy who has fallen far behind in the advancement of technology, it absolutely baffled my mind that only a tiny fragment of the internet is available through a Google search. The rest, which makes up approximately 99.9%, is hidden and requires a special browser for access. With the help of a handy-dandy YouTube tutorial, I quickly downloaded the Tor browser and went on my way to search for the hidden aspects of the internet, as one naturally does. It couldn't have taken more than half an hour of clicking on shared onion links before I stumbled across something that quenched my thirst for the obscene forever. The website itself was rather plain, just a black background with a video player in the center and a chat box beneath. Within a few seconds of entering the website, the video itself had loaded and automatically started playing. What was depicted before me was a scrawny-looking man in his early 20s, strapped to a chair and covered in wounds. In the upper left corner of the video, a timer ran, counting up each second. 24 minutes and 14 seconds. Please stop, please. It was an accident, I swear, he yelled. A larger man entered the picture, a large needle in his hand connected to an empty syringe. Without speaking a word, he stuck the needle as far as it could go, into the victim's abdomen. He let out a loud scream as the man removed the needle and plunged it back in. After a few stabs, the man grabbed a hammer and hit the victim straight in his jaw, shattering his mandible, leaving him unable to form any coherent speech. He let out a gargled whimper before passing out. I tried to forward the video, sure it had to be fake. But that's when I realized that it wasn't pre-recorded footage, but a live stream. 26 minutes and 12 seconds were the words that lit up the screen. The chat beneath the video went wild, calling out the victim as a pathetic excuse of a human being, demanding the man to continue the torture. A few seconds passed, and the chat was replaced by a voting form containing only two options: life or death. The votes were quickly counting, the bar for death rising rapidly. As much as I could stomach, I wouldn't be part of an active murder, so I quickly voted for life. In the end, the results were displayed on the screen. Out of 200 people, the results were 95% for death, 4% for life, 1% did not vote. 10 people had tried to save the poor kid, but it wasn't enough. Without further warning, the man grabbed the hammer and started repeatedly hitting him, starting from the legs and working his way up until all that remained was a bloody pile of broken flesh. I sat speechless, staring helplessly at the screen as I noticed that my camera light had lit up. The video player vanished, and in its place, 10 smaller boxes popped up, all displaying people from various places around the world, all being unknowingly filmed by their own webcams. To my absolute horror, one of the boxes showed my bedroom and myself wearing a terrified expression. It quickly dawned on me that these were the people who voted to save the poor kid. Who will be next? A message said as a timer counted down towards 0. A few boxes turned black, to which the chat responded with laughter, a hopeless attempt at escape. 3, 2, 1. 9 of the 10 pictures disappeared from the screen, including my own, leaving the screen occupied by a middle-aged Asian man frozen in fear. We'll see you soon. Good luck. I let out a sigh of both relief and panic. I had escaped unharmed, but not everyone was that lucky. Of course, I called the police, but by the time they could even look into it, the link had long since expired. I don't know what else I could have done, but it taught me
I'm gonna
not
leave
to
you
look
here
too
for a
deep
while,
into
Bear.
the depths
I
of
know
the
that
dark
you
web.
are amazing,
I'm lucky
and
to
I
still be
love you
alive,
so much,
and
but you
it's safe
need
to
to stay
say
here
that
for a
I've stuck
while
to YouTube
and
videos
recover
and
from
Reddit ever
walking
since.
for so long. Okay, I think it's time to finally reveal the new area. That will probably, if I never breed again, will completely keep them fed on all the way until I can expand this area even
No,
more.
I mean the fantastic medications invented to cure anything from infections to psychological problems. The only problem is the excessive restriction on legal drugs. The amount of research, work, and potential that gets lost with each denial from the FDA. Just because something doesn't work exactly as intended doesn't mean it's useless. I say this as a person who's always had trouble sleeping. Not in the sense that I can't fall asleep, but rather that I need a whole 11 hours just to feel barely rested. A fact that absolutely does not fly in my line of work. After trying conventional drugs that were aimed at people with narcolepsy, none proved to be an adequate solution. I had no choice but to turn to the illegal side of things. Think about all the drugs that never reach the shelves at your local pharmacy due to failing to get FDA approval. It's not like their recipes and research just get thrown out. No, there's a whole market for them buried in the depths of the dark web, available to anyone who knows where to look. Of course, it has its risks, and it isn't something I'd recommend for your average Joe. I, however, was desperate. Months passed, and I tried numerous different substances, some which helped a little, while others just made it worse. In the end, I landed on a product simply called Nox. Using a P.O. box, the medication arrived within a week. To my surprise, rather than finding a bottle filled with colorful pills, I had just received the one, wrapped in a high-quality, expensive-looking package. Based on the forum I found it on, no one had experienced any adverse effects, so I stupidly ingested it with little hesitation, impatiently awaiting its results. On any given day, I'd be tired around 11, but with the pill making its way through my digestive tract, I realized that midnight had come and gone, leaving me wide awake. Morning came, and yet I didn't need any sleep. It was great. I got all my work done at a record pace and still had plenty of leftover leisure time. It caused some jealousy at the office, but considering my competitive nature, it didn't bother me in the slightest. Days turned to weeks, then weeks turned to months, and I had successfully eluded the need to sleep. By all logical aspects of biology, my brain should have deteriorated, driving me to the brink of madness. But even a year after ingesting the pill, I remained sharp as ever. The only thing I noticed was my skin seeming thinner, paler, as if I had fallen slightly ill. I initially felt suspicious of the pill, but my tired-looking facade could just as easily be explained by the excessive amount of work. It wasn't as if I could stop taking the pills anyway, seeing as I'd only taken the one. That's when I noticed the first sore. It looked like an ulcer, a bed sore, but it was situated on my stomach just below the navel. It didn't hurt or anything, so I just put some cream on and waited, but it kept growing. During the next week, patches of skin started falling off, revealing the fat and muscle beneath. It didn't particularly hurt, but it was growing day by day, and it horrified me. I quickly tried to find the site I'd purchased it from, but in the ocean of hidden onions that is the dark web, it had simply vanished, and the link had expired. As far as I could tell, no one, not even the FDA, had ever heard about a pill called Nox. Over the next few weeks, my physical state deteriorated, and the doctors were baffled. Yet I remained completely lucid. Even sedation for procedures had no effect on me. Eventually, after months of my skin melting off, my heart nearly stopped. Yet I couldn't fall unconscious. As I type this, my body is rotting away, and I'm gradually losing function of my arms and legs, and my vision is fading. The only thing remaining is my mind, as wide awake as ever. Once I'm done here, I'm putting a bullet in my brain, but I'm worried that even then I'll have some sliver of consciousness to keep me awake as they put me in the ground, where I'll lay in darkness forever. Ever since its invention, I've dreamed of getting my hands on some Vanta black liquid. Imagine a substance so dark it can obscure any three-dimensional shape and turn it into a mere shadow. I just never thought something so harmless and fun could cause my demise. While it's available for purchase under certain circumstances, it's not something just anyone can buy. Of course, if you know where to look on the dark web, you can get anything you want. To be fair, of all the horrible things found on the dark web, Vanta Black liquid is among the less sinister options. After just a few clicks, I found a vial of paint available for a cheap price. Even if the paint turned out to be fake, it wouldn't be much of a loss. With little thought, I purchased one vial and eagerly awaited its arrival. The inconspicuous package arrived a couple days later. It was a cube-shaped vial full of the light-absorbing liquid. If not for the feel it had in my hand, I never could have guessed it was a solid object. I was ecstatic, but after a thorough inspection, I noticed a minuscule crack in the vial. A drop of liquid seeped out through the hole and fell gently onto the doormat below. What looked like a hole into an infinite void formed on the mat. I bent down to remove it with a dirty cloth. As I started rubbing the spilled paint, I could have sworn my fingers slipped deeper into the stain. I immediately retracted my hand, certain I must have been mistaken. After the initial shock wore off, I dipped the cloth back into the stain, and it just sank through. After several attempts at poking the stain, I lifted the doormat up to check if the hole continued into the floor. To my surprise, it was clean. At that point, I was more curious than afraid. Baffled by the impossible spots, I could do little more than stare in awe at the thing. Then I came to the horrifying realization that the hole was growing. I grabbed a few plastic bags and chucked the doormat into one, making sure to double wrap and seal. I thought the situation was under control, that I contained the ever-growing void. Alas, one of the Vanta Black drops had hit my hand. Without hesitation, I rushed to scrub my hands, praying that it wasn't too late. Unfortunately, no matter what kind of soap I applied, the stain wouldn't budge. By the time I had given up, it had already grown to the size of a marble. In absolute panic, I rushed to the doctor. Despite his initial doubt at my situation, he quickly came around once he saw the bizarre spot on my hand. He prodded me with needles and various probes, futilely attempting to get samples for the lab. All the while, it kept growing. Before long, it had consumed my entire right hand, though it was still visible as a silhouette. I had long since lost any use of it, leaving it as little more than a limp appendage. Days went by, and the darkness grew up my arm. In a last-ditch attempt at saving my life, the doctors all agreed that amputation would be the only feasible solution. It was a devastating loss, but worth it to save my life. I signed all the necessary papers using my one remaining hand, and they rushed me into an operating room. While the surgery only lasted a few hours, rehabilitation would take weeks, if not months. The doctors entered my room as I awoke from the anesthesia. Though the surgery had been a clear success, they didn't seem
Hopefully
happy.
this isn't corrupted wool.
What's wrong? I asked
Wondering
with
what
a
that
groggy
is.
voice.
It's wool that
"I'm
corrupts the
sorry,"
world
was all he could
very
say.
slowly, spreading
The drugs
everywhere,
had
making
already started
everything
to wear
wool.
off, and
Eventually
I
you
could feel
die and
pins
just
and needles
become
all over my
wool.
body.
You
I
might think,
lifted up
oh,
my
it might be
shirt
fun
and
playing a world just made out of
at
wool
the
as a
horrific
person
sight.
made out of wool.
My
It's not.
entire torso
It's
was
not
covered
like
in
that at all.
hundreds
Your
and
eyes
hundreds of
just
tiny holes. It looked
slowly
as
get
if chunks
corrupt.
of flesh had been removed,
So let's just hope that this is
replaced
normal
only
wool
by
from
that
Minecraft.
god-forsaken
You're making it
Vantablack
look like
paint.
it is
We
corrupted,
think the
like
substance
this
has
used to be
spread
like an
through your bloodstream.
outhouse, and
There's
it's
nothing more
slowly
we can
becoming
do,
made out of
the
wool.
doctor said. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've lost my legs, my arms, and most of my internal organs. I haven't felt my heartbeat since yesterday, and I can hardly breathe. What terrifies me even more than the liquid replacing my entire body is the fact that I haven't died yet. Whatever the case, I've been isolated. The doctors put me in a special chamber to prevent the further spread of the liquid. I guess it is for the best. I'll be completely replaced by Vantablack soon. I just hope it kills me first.
Yeah, that's
When
totally
people
worth
want
it.
digital footprints to be scoured away clean and then replaced by other preferable images, that's when I get the call. I was once hired by an oil sheik to replace several faces on an embassy security feed to hide their involvement in the assassination of a journalist.
Let's see. Ooh,
Remember the two women
slowness.
who contaminated and killed the North Korean
I
man
might,
and his half-brother in the
maybe.
airport? Those women were originally
Do
a
you guys
pair
need
of
more
North
beds?
Korean
Like, come on,
goons.
breed
But
for
I
some
removed
villagers.
them
God.
and set up that pair of
I'm
lady
gonna get
stooges
more,
to take the fall.
like, oh, wait, farmer.
My
I need to trade with
ethics
the
are
farmer.
porous,
I need to see what he
and
wants.
my greed is insatiable.
Beets.
In
I can get
October
some
of
beets for
last
you,
year,
bruh.
I was hired to deepfake some
Pumpkins. I do
footage.
have
A
pumpkins
Black
now.
Ops team
Melons.
had
I wish I had
infiltrated
melons,
a
but no.
top-secret lab
Ooh,
in China
cookies. I do need
and
cookies.
stolen some
And
highly
cake!
violent
Give me the
bioweapons.
cake! Ooh,
The lab
let's get some
itself
of
wasn't
those.
the problem. The team consisted of professional ghosts, entering and exiting like invisible ninjas. Not a trace left behind in the lab's
Well,
hardwired
if
net.
this world does get corrupted,
But
at least I
then,
have a copy.
the team leader did
And then I'll
something
know
so
not to do
stupid,
this.
so outside his mission scope, that I was brought in for
Once these
damage
cakes
control
run out, I
before
always have to
any
replace them.
possible leaks
Or at
caused a
least try.
tsunami
I'm
of
gonna try to do that.
geopolitical fallout. He met in Shanghai the following day at the Ritz-Carlton with somebody well known in the world of presidential politics. This figure, traveling under the name Randall Mariani, is a former NYC mayor who now pursues shadow diplomacy for the current administration. Anyway, this guy was caught on security cameras in the lobby exchanging envelopes with the leader of the infiltration team. I was hired that night by a shell company operating out of the Cayman Islands that goes by the name of deluxedeepfake.com. fortnite.com. They wanted every piece of digital evidence tying these two people together to be deep-faked, replacing the former NYC mayor with the son of the president's political opponent in the upcoming election. It left a bad taste in my mouth, but the money being thrown at me was enough to buy mouthwash in industrial-sized drums. However, that money never came through, because the moment I finished my deepfake, my computer suddenly fried. From motherboard to monitor, dead. Then the power to my house was cut. Then the guys in black, those same invisible ninjas that hit the Chinese lab, came busting through my windows. I'm alive because I work in a basement with an escape hatch. I snuck away. Now I live day by day, constantly looking over my shoulder. Coronavirus is spreading throughout the world. Someday, I'll get back online and reverse my deep fake.
Well, I think I'm just going to work on the world offline a little bit because I'm getting tired of talking. But it was a pleasure being with you guys today. I will either play today or sometime next week. Oh, remember, 3 days a week my upload schedule.